So our devotional this morning, as we start, is going to be in James chapter 3. So as you recall, these series of devotionals are to encourage you, of course, but also to give you a little model, a little peek of what it looks like to unpack Scripture for folks in a counseling session. But I'm also slating these things in ways that are teaching you counseling principles, especially ones that are pertinent to marriage and family counseling. So James chapter 4, we're not going to do today, we're going to do for our next devotional. But James chapter 4, as I mentioned earlier, is one of these sort of gold standard texts for biblical counseling because it is so brilliantly inward in explaining the dynamics of how our desires, motivated by sin, wage war within us, which results in a waging war outside us. That's what conflict comes from. We'll look at that in our next devotional. For this devotional, I actually want to look at the passage, the pericope that leads up to that. And that's James 3, verse 13 through 18. Because it's funny, for as much as we use James 4, we often overlook the very important part of the argument that lays the foundation for it, and that's James 3, 13 through 18. Remember, chapter divisions are not inspired. Okay? So this, I hope, is also a gold standard text for marital conflicts. It tells us a lot of things about who we are and a lot of things about what God expects. So let me read this for us. Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. But the wisdom from above is pure, first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. This is very pertinent to marriage counseling because it talks about the motives that lead to conflict, that lead to selfishness. But it uses words, at least our translation here, uses words we don't typically associate with sort of normal everyday interrelationships. So the two things, or the two terms that James is really going after here, look at verse 14, is if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts. Okay? When I say bitter jealousy, you probably tend to think of seething in anger of something some other family has, right? Or some dynamic at work where one dude gets promoted and another doesn't. Something like that. And when you hear selfish ambition, what do you think about? You probably think about a white-collar upstart who wants to climb his way up the ladder on Wall Street or in some major corporation or something like that. Ambition, it's evil because it takes away from family time and all the rest of that stuff. That's certainly a good example of it. But these terms are way broader than what we typically think of. Okay? Bitter jealousy, in this context, I think is more referring to the tendency to want to get what we want, even at the cost of someone else getting what they want. So in other words, if they get what we want and we feel shortchanged that we didn't get what we want, that's what jealousy is. And in marriage, as we have established, you have one sinner with certain wants and needs and expectations, another sinner with certain wants and needs and expectations, and God always arranges it in His wisdom that for one to have what they want, it will require the other in some way to not get what they want. In other words, you can't possibly manage a marriage where both people are always getting what they want. So, the temptation towards bitter jealousy is not occasionally there, it's constantly there. So, it's in the little things, like when the alarm goes off and the one person isn't, it's on her side of the bed and she's not turning it off and it's waking you up. And inside you're like, how inconsiderate. You end up kicking her or something like that. No, you don't really do that. Turn it off. There's a sharp word. She turns it off. Because what you wanted in that moment, sleep or peace of mind or whatever, she wasn't giving you. And so there's a bitter jealousy. Selfish ambition is very similar. It's not like these are two separate things. I think it's sort of these are overlapping concepts here. Selfish ambition is not just the Wall Street guy. Selfish ambition, we could translate actually better, I think, here, is self-seeking. Self-seeking. Being motivated to pursue or seek after the things that benefit the self. So in a marriage, people can really be motivated to do the things that basically please them without thought for what would please the other or serve the other. That's selfish ambition or self-seeking. Okay? So, here James says, if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition, where? In your hearts. Do not boast and be false to the truth. Why on earth would he say that? This is what I love about James. James has a reputation of like being against Paul by saying faith plus works saves you. Obviously, we know that's not what James is saying. James is saying that a faith will work. Okay? Genuine faith will always work. But even there, sometimes we can think of James as talking about sort of external works, like James really emphasized the way we should live outwardly. He does do that, but James actually, more than a lot of the authors, talks about the inner work, talks about what goes on inside the heart, and how faith results in works that start within and then move to without. So he's talking about bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in the heart. And then he says, don't lie and be false to the truth if it's in your heart. Meaning, there is a tendency, there's a built-in tendency with jealousy and selfish ambition to deny that it is motivating you. There's a natural tendency to not recognize it and not want to acknowledge it. It hides. It's very similar to what we said the other day about the deceitful mechanism, the self-deceptive mechanism of sin. Okay? It's basically the same thing here. But James is acknowledging that no one wants to acknowledge that jealousy and ambition are a natural part of you. Wake up and they are there. They are present. They are motivating forces within you. So don't boast. Don't brag. Don't be false to the truth. Don't lie. Don't act like this isn't an issue, is what he's saying. And in marriage counseling, sometimes that is the absolute hardest part of what you do. It's really easy to put like nice little labels on it, biblical labels. Well, that's bitter jealousy. Well, that's selfish ambition. But convincing them of that is really, really hard. This is why, my friends, we have to have a very robust doctrine of sin. Okay? Sin is not just outward action. Do you know that? Are you actively aware of that? Know that not just theoretically. Know that in terms of the way you counsel and the way you practice. Sin, we always think of as external action. Sin is robbing an old lady. Sin is cheating on my taxes. Sin is lying. Sin is stealing a candy bar. Those things are sins. If that's all we conceive of as sin, then it would be very possible for you to get through a day without sinning. Right? Maybe a morning. Maybe an hour. I don't know. But with a biblically robust understanding of sin, if I asked you the question, could you go 1 minute without sinning? You could say, well, maybe if I were unconscious. Even then, no. Right? You couldn't go 1 nanosecond without sinning. Not that you're actively sinning, because that's not the point. Sin is not just outward action. You can go a minute and an hour and whatever without necessarily sinning in terms of an outward action. Sin is an outward action and an internal state of being. Okay? Get this. An internal state of being. Meaning, my thinking, my desires, my intentions, my loyalties, my feelings, my values, whatever we could describe as things that go on in the heart, they are stained and tainted with sin. Always. Always. I'm not saying this to condemn you or condemn your counselees, right? Because we believe in the gospel. But this is a necessary groundwork for it. So in marriage counseling, you will frequently have people that are convinced that their motives in a given situation or regularly in life are quite pure because they didn't yell at their wife, which is an outward sin, which they probably didn't yell at their wife. And they're right and accurate in that. That doesn't mean that they weren't motivated by selfish ambition, self-seeking. Or the wife can say, I've never cheated on my husband. I don't know what he's all about. I just enjoy this friendship with this other man. That is a very stunted understanding of sin and the proclivities toward it. She may not have touched this other man's body, but her heart is inclined to loving and valuing him more than her husband. That itself is a problem. That itself is sin. So, this is the importance of having a biblically robust view of sin. Not just outward action, but inner state of being that stains the very thoughts and desires and feelings that we have. So don't let people be more impressed with themselves than they ought to be. And that's hard, guys. That's hard to do in counseling because you are going to be called frequently. You are going to be called judgmental. But here's the response to that accusation. I would be judgmental if I were pronouncing judgment on you. I'm not doing that. I am pointing out the sinful motivations of the heart so that you might seek grace and not be judged. So that you might seek the favor of God in Christ so that you can be cleansed from this. And you can enjoy a relationship that's far better than clearly what's going on in your home right now. That's what you say to that. Have a robust understanding of sin, okay? So, jealousy, self-seeking are in the hearts. Don't lie and be false to the truth. He goes on, verse 15. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. This is where I'm so used to talking for Paul, James. This is where James is making the contrast between a heavenly wisdom and an earthly wisdom, okay? Wisdom being, not that it's wise, the earthly wisdom is actually wise in the sense of that it's good, but it's wisdom in the sense of it's a system of thinking. It's sort of a logical way of making sense of the world. It's a reasoning. You have reasoning from below and reasoning from above. And it's amazing to me that he calls this wisdom it is not the wisdom that comes down from above, i.e. from God. Instead, it is earthly. That means it doesn't consider the things beyond the earth, is how you can think of it. It is merely a product of a godless way of thinking. It is earthly, It is unspiritual. It's saying the same thing here. It doesn't consider the spiritual character of God. It's unspiritual. And then the last one. Isn't that amazing? It's demonic. It's demonic. I often get asked in various contexts, hey, is there ever, have you ever counseled someone where there was a demon involved? And I say, yes, I have. Every single time I counsel, okay? Because I actually believe that the Bible speaks of the world as, the Bible speaks of our sin as constantly motivated by three different enemies, okay? You guys know this. I think you know this from your systematics courses. The enemies of your soul are your own flesh, your own sinful nature, which is a power within you. That's how it's spoken of. It's a presence, it's a power. It's what I just talked about, sin as inner disposition. It is the world, okay? Remember we read from 1 John yesterday, don't love the world or the things of the world. That is the system of unbelief that raises itself up against Christ. So the world is out there. The world doesn't love Christ. Even when you watch CNN and gasp, Fox News, you're getting world views that are of the world, okay? They are not motivated by a system of covenant belief in God, okay? So, I'm not saying don't watch those things, by the way. I'm just be discerning. And then the last one is the devil, right? So, the flesh, the world, the devil, and his demons. But the idea is not necessarily that they're kind of like possessing that married couple in the middle of the fight, okay? Though sometimes I've kind of wondered. The idea is that we don't know how they do it exactly, but demons are always provoking and influencing and trying to shroud the truth from people. In other words, Satan walks around like a roaring lion seeking those to devour. So I don't want to go off on this point too much and make this sort of all about like spiritual warfare and like you have to pray the demons off people and when they're fighting in a marriage. Nothing like that. Because you know how you oppose demonic forces? You want to know? You don't go in and pray and bind them and have like some kind of a ritual. You don't do that. You know what you do? You open your mouth and you proclaim the gospel. You proclaim the rule of the King, Jesus. That's how you bind. That's how you drive away the demons that Jesus has already defeated. That's what you do. So it really doesn't look all that different in the counseling room in one sense. So what I'm saying, even in pointing this out, is people need to realize that as it dawns on them that their motives are self-seeking, that their motives are jealous, those things seem like very kind of mundane, daily, vanilla things that we wish they weren't in our lives. Let's kind of chip away at it. Let's kind of work at it. No, that's not how James is talking about it. James is saying this is demonic. This is dangerous. This is the kind of thing that goes on in a dark world where there is no light of the gospel. Don't tolerate this in your hearts. This is what he's saying. Verse 16, for where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. By the way, that's, I think, what he unpacks in chapter 4, this disorder, the conflict that comes. Disorder and every vile practice. When there is disorder, when there is vile practice, okay, meaning practices, conducts, ways of treating each other that are wrong in the eyes of God, okay? Disorder, conflict, things like that. When those things are present, this earthly wisdom, this demonic wisdom, this fleshly wisdom is operative. It is. So what you can say to people is when there is marital conflict, this is not just a miscommunication issue. This is not just, we need to have better methods of listening before we speak. That can very well be the case, but it's not just that. It's not just, well, we're really stressed because finances are pressing, or we're going through a certain time where our kid has a disease and we're overwhelmed with sort of the anxiety and stress of that. All those external things we want to factor in and we want to be considerate of. But the heart is responding to circumstance. It's not the circumstances that do it. It's the heart's responses to those circumstances. And that's actually what sets biblical counseling apart from all other models. We believe in an actively responding heart that operates before God and vis-a-vis God. So then James brings up this contrast, okay? But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. But he actually introduced the wisdom from above back in verse 13. He says, who's wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct, okay, so good conduct is the opposite of the disorder in every vile practice. By his good conduct, let him show what? What's the phrase? Look carefully. Let him show his works in what? What do some of the translations say? In the meekness of wisdom. What do other translations say? In the what's that? In wisdom's gentleness. What translation is that? Okay. They're always trying to take the unique angle on things. I don't even understand that. I like the meekness of wisdom. We're going to go with that. The meekness of wisdom. You know what another word for meekness is? A synonym for it? What would you guess? Meekness isn't weakness. Yeah, don't. You're like, I'm scared to guess. You're going to not like my translation. And don't give me that translation. That's terrible. I love the Holman Christian Standard. I just will publicly say that. I have it in my office and I read it. What's that? Humility. That's exactly right. Meekness is not weakness. Okay? We think of meek people as like little mousy, quivering people. That's not what meekness is, because Moses was meek. He was the meekest of all men until Jesus. Jesus was meek. Meekness is humility. Okay? So here's something incredibly instructive for us in marriage counseling. And it's something we're going to unpack even more when we do our devotion on James 4, because he expands it in the next chapter. Humility is the foundation and the starting point of wisdom. In Proverbs, it's called the fear of the Lord. This is, again, conceptually, it overlaps with the idea of humility. But why is that? Why is humility the avenue to this wisdom from above that has all these features that we just read? Okay, to know what you don't know. That's right. That's good. There's an acknowledgement that I don't have what I ought to have. What else? That's exactly right. There's a preference for others, which is the opposite of self-seeking and jealousy, isn't it? It's the opposite. I don't know how often you experience jealousy and envy. I do. And every time I experience that, it is a reminder to me that my heart is not constructed like Jesus Christ's. And I need his character to increasingly humble me so that I don't walk around thinking, oh man, I'm a loser. It's not an idea of having a low opinion of yourself, like we said yesterday. It's the idea of not thinking of yourself, of thinking of others, of being happy when good things happen to them as if you were happy about them happening to you. So think of your brother or your sister, if you have a brother or sister. What if you found out today that they just landed a promotion where they made $150,000 a year, and suddenly, overnight, they make way more money than you're ever going to make in your entire life? Okay? Would you be happy for them? Would you start to look around at your apartment or your house or the car you drive? Would you start to kind of crunch the numbers of what your retirement's going to look like? would you feel bad about what you don't have? Even if you're happy for them, would you start feeling bad about what you have? These are all indications, friends, that we're not Jesus and that we need Jesus. We need the wisdom from above. We need the humility that brings it. So when that humility is there, verse 17 unpacks a lot of beautiful things that you want to lay out for couples that you're counseling. Knowing that this purity, this peaceableness, this gentleness, this openness to reason, all the things that are listed there are impossible for them apart from the humility of seeking Jesus for them. The humility of acknowledging, I'm not like this, I don't do this, I am selfishly ambitious, and therefore I need Jesus. And when that occurs, friends, you will be surprised. God will give you so many opportunities. Guys, you're going to fail all the time in counseling, but God's also going to give you some amazing opportunities to witness purity coming to a couple, peaceableness coming to a couple who have warred for years. People who are harsh and abrupt suddenly being gentle with one another. Someone who is so close-minded and convinced that they alone are right in this and won't hear another opinion, suddenly they start asking questions and they're open to the perspectives of others. That's what it means to be open to reason. That someone who has been harsh and condemning is suddenly full of mercy and good fruits. They're impartial and they're sincere. It's beautiful to watch. So my advice to you as you counsel in marriage is it can be helpful to take a list like this in 17 and to talk about what that would practically look like, the contrast between impurity and purity, or the contrast between being belligerent or being peaceable, the contrast between being harsh and being gentle. Those are good things to unpack and give people a vision for what it looks like. So do that, but don't do that to the exclusion of the gateway of humility in acknowledging their desperate need for Christ. Okay? That's the point of James here. And the result in verse 18 is beautiful. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Why a harvest of, why righteousness of all things? A harvest of righteousness. I think it's emphasizing the simple fact that we very quickly overlook. What a couple wants when they're coming into you for counseling, most, whether they acknowledge it or not, what they need most and should want most is not a ceasefire. And it's not even peace in the sense that they're thinking about it. What they should want and are actually wanting more than anything is righteousness. Righteousness. Righteousness is what brings order to the human heart and order to the human soul and order to our relationships. Righteousness. It's a category we don't casually think in because it's foreign to us. What does righteousness have to do with this? What does righteousness have to do with the fact that we just don't love each other anymore and we don't want to be together anymore? Well, righteousness is the only thing that sets the heart right to love what it ought to love, to believe what it ought to believe, to act how it ought to act. And righteousness, my friends, is something that you cannot have apart from Christ. Because the righteousness that the gospel speaks of is a foreign righteousness. Get this. Drive this into your people. It's a foreign righteousness. That means you will not be able to construct or figure this thing out in an ultimate sense. You need the righteousness of another granted to you so that you can live according to it. This is what we talked about with definite. There's a definite beginning to sanctification. The righteousness of Christ is granted to you, justification. And then that's what allows it to be manifest in the life. in terms of the progressive sanctification. So a harvest of righteousness, something that we cannot have on our own, suddenly we have a harvest of. Suddenly, I mean, you guys remember, did you guys have harvest festivals in your town? Anybody from small towns where they had harvest festivals? I love that. That's my favorite time of year. Everybody's in a good mood because they're pulling in the results of all their hard work, and you get cider and donuts. That was a Cleveland thing. Does anybody else, cider, apple cider and donuts, is that a common combination? I'm getting at least one nod. Thank you. Tobacco and bourbon. Very good. Then you go down to Louisville and watch horses race and bet. It's kind of sad that Kentucky, like their major industries, bourbon, tobacco, and horse racing. There you are. God bless America. I forget what I was even saying. Yeah, harvest. Thank you. I love the illustration here because it's saying this isn't sort of a trickling of righteousness. This is a harvest of righteousness. And guys, you will get to witness that harvest at various points in your ministry. And it's thrilling. And you will get to witness it at various points in your own life. We all have seasons where we have sort of a renewed vigor to seek the Lord. Often those follow seasons of conviction and seasons of kind of reaching the bottom on certain things. And when you seek the Lord and when you have a renewed interest in humbly acknowledging your need for Him, and that harvest of righteousness comes about, you're suddenly treating other people in ways that you didn't even really plan to treat them, but it just is this overflow of who Christ is in you. We ought to pray for that. We ought to seek that. That ought to thrill us more than the idea of making it to the next stage of life, whatever that next stage for you might be. Graduation for most of you, right? Or all of you. I didn't mean to insult anyone here. So, a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace, okay? That's how you sow it. That's how you plant it. That's how you prepare the harvest to come someday. Be a peacemaker by being humble. So in our last time together, we talked about the first point of the husband. The first verb of the husband is to love by sacrificing, from Ephesians chapter 5. Now, we are going to continue our understanding of the role of the husband by talking about to nurture by knowing. To nurture by knowing. That's another way the Bible speaks of the role of the husband. So, turn to 1 Peter 3, verse 7. This is where I get this. First Peter 3, verse 7. Likewise, husbands, so this is just after he's talked to wives, as we looked at the other day. Likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. So, what he's getting at, one of the key elements of the instruction here is to know your wife. Okay? What does it mean to know? To live with your wife in an understanding way means that you're familiar with and you're sensitive to her frailties and her disposition. You're familiar with and you're sensitive to her frailties and her disposition. In other words, a husband needs to be knowledgeable of the way his wife thinks, what she feels, the way she acts, so that he can lead her appropriately. And by appropriately, I mean gently, helpfully. I don't think Peter here is saying, okay, so live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel. I don't think he's making sort of a misogynistic statement of how weak-willed or frail or pathetic women are. That's not what he's saying here. He's using language that indicates delicacy, okay? They're delicate. Again, not that they're weak and frail, but they're delicate because they're precious, okay? They're precious, and they ought to be honored and understood as precious so that you handle them appropriately. I think a good contemporary metaphor for this would be you don't treat them like your kid's plastic tumbler sippy cup, okay? You instead treat them like your grandmother's inherited china. You put them in a place of honor. You know the contours of what they need. So with your grandmother's inherited china cup, you aren't just shoving it in the dishwasher. You're handling it with care. You're hand washing it. You're hand drying it. You're placing it back up in the curio because you want to preserve and treat it as an honorable vessel. With a kid's sippy cup, if it's in the back of the car and it's had milk in it that's turned into cottage cheese because it's been there for 3 weeks, guess what you do with it if you're a sane person? You throw it away. I'm sorry, maybe that was wasteful and you should clean it out and be responsible. I just throw it away. That is disgusting. Okay? But the point is, you can leave something like that in the back of a minivan. You would never leave the precious inheritance of fine china in the back of a minivan. I think that's what's going on here. So a husband has to know his wife in order to be able to treat her appropriately. This takes time, okay? This takes time. That is so ugly. Let's try it again. This takes time. So what this means is husbands have to prioritize in their schedule, in their actual living, what it means to be able to be up to date on the experience of his wife. It is not acceptable to have the kind of work schedule or the kind of lifestyle schedule, hobbies, whatever it is, that take you away from the wife so much that you don't really even actively know her, right? That's not acceptable. You, I believe, by this command, are being commanded to spend time with the wife. That's not the language Peter's using here. But he is using live with your wife in an understanding way, and you only acquire understanding through the exertion of time. There's familiarity takes time. So there's seasons, guys. There's seasons in a husband's life, and you want to be sensitive to this in your counseling. There's seasons in life, or there's vocational realities, as we've already talked about, that take them away. You know, a troop is going to be on the other side of the globe for 12 to 18 months, depending on his commission, right? There are things like that. I've been reading stories on the coal miners of West Virginia in the 1920s and 30s. Those guys lived underground for 12 hours a day. And when they came home, they would just collapse in a dirty, messy pile on the floor, sleep, and get up and do it again, right? So we don't want to act like the American cultural standard of living is the only way to make sure that you, like, there are pressing matters is what I'm saying. But my point is this. You know when a husband has a heart that's inclined to knowing his wife and thus making time for that, and when his heart doesn't really have that as a motivating value and thus doesn't make it. So what you're pressing for is make it a motivating value of the way you use your time, husband, to know your wife. So it takes time, it takes effort. It takes effort. So I've heard many sermons and talks on this passage, right, that says, live with your wives in an understanding way. And they talk about the relation of the terminology here to exegesis, right, to studying one's wife, knowing one's wife. I don't know how much we want to press that, but the point is good, that it takes effort, it takes labor to observe. Labor to observe. This process, this effort is listening. It's a lot of listening. It's a lot of observing. And that's hard for us dudes, honestly. It's hard for us because I don't think that way naturally. And a lot of guys don't think that way naturally. But it takes us sort of not trying to rein in the situation and direct it and control it in every single aspect. It takes us kind of backing off from that a little bit sometimes in order to kind of see where the wife is at, see where she naturally goes, see the things that she loves to talk about, or hear the things she loves to talk about, see the things that she loves to do, know her disposition, know the kinds of things that really discourage her, know the kinds of things that cause her fear and anxiety, know the kinds of relationships that she's most edified by, because there's a lot of different kinds of female relationships at church and in other places, right? There's a lot of different kinds of them. Know what edifies your wife. Know her gifting. Know where she best serves others. You just have to observe and know. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes faith. It takes faith. Look at the language here, right? So, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing her honor as the weaker vessel. And then look at the grounding of it. Since, right? This is the ground of the command I just gave. Since they are heirs with you of the grace of life. In other words, this is why it takes faith to do this. Because the ground that Peter is appealing to on why they ought to live with their wives in a knowledgeable way is because they are going to inherit the same grace that you are in the end. So, this is a spiritual task. Her privileged status as a daughter of God is the impetus for putting forth the time and effort of knowing her. Please get that. And get that into the minds of the men that you're counseling. Her privileged status as a daughter of God is the impetus for putting forth the time and effort of knowing her. She is a royal princess. And I don't mean that in the Disney way. That annoys me to death. I'm trying to eliminate princesses from my home, and I'm not very successful at it. What I mean is she is an heir. She is a daughter. That's the language used here. An heir of the grace of life. An inheritor in the royal line of those who receive the royal crown. Treat her like one who will wear the royal crown. So there's a tendency in men and husbands, I think, to take wives for granted in a way that doesn't show honor to her, in a way that doesn't prioritize her. If Dr. Moeller walked into the room, and if your wife walked into the room, I have a feeling most of us would give much more honor and respect to Dr. Moeller, and I realize in social situations and other things there's an appropriateness to that because, blah, 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 blah. But what I'm getting at is this. We shouldn't always prioritize other relationships and honor other people that in some way will benefit you in your ambitions and in your efforts. This shouldn't be the primary relationship of honor. The primary relationship of honor should be one's wife, because there's a tendency to take her for granted, I think, is why Peter's saying that. So, she's a co-heir with you of the grace of life. And then finally, it says, for the purpose that your prayers may not be hindered, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Which tells husbands, and you tell husbands this in counseling, don't you dare think that you can treat your wife in a small and belittling way. Don't you dare think that you can ignore your wife and expect God to be okay with you. Don't think that you can be close to God without pursuing a close relationship with your wife, without caring for her in those ways. I really do think if husbands want to invite the opposition of God, they should treat their wives like garbage. Because what we see here is a direct connection that he's making to the hindering of prayer. Think about what prayer is. Prayer is the means by which we communicate with the holy God. Your prayers, just because you speak them out loud and God is omniscient and omnipresent and can hear them, like literally, I don't like it when people say it literally. It's literally, okay? Why do I bring these things up? Just because God can literally, audibly hear what you're saying doesn't mean that He hears your prayers. It takes an act of Jesus for God to hear your prayers. Do you know this? Do you realize this theologically? So what this means is you contradict your status in Christ, by which He brings your prayers to the Father. You contradict your status in Christ by mistreating your wife, by not honoring her, by not seeking to love her. And if you're married in here, men, I think you've probably you've probably sensed this experientially even. So you've sensed this even in your own course of experience. Because when I have a fight with my wife, when I mistreat her and don't love her as Christ is calling me to love her, and then I go up to my bedroom to open my Bible and do devotions, have you ever had this, guys? It's completely dead. The Bible is like a stone book to me. And it's not because the Bible's not effective or anything about the Bible or God has changed. It's because I am inclined against Him. I'm inclined against God because I'm inclined against my wife. So please hear me carefully. I'm not saying like if you don't have a good relationship with your wife, you can never have a good relationship. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is this. Part of the central call of your pursuit of God is your pursuit of your wife. And you can't act like you can fall off on the one and expect the other one to do just fine. That's what I'm saying. Similar to what John says in 1 John when he says, don't claim to love God and yet you hate your brothers. You can't love God who you haven't seen when you don't even love your brothers who you have seen. Okay? So let's get even more practical on this point in terms of knowing. Practically speaking, help guys that you're counseling, help them see that their wives will have certain, I should write this out, every man's wives will have certain, or individual, wives will have certain propensities towards sin, okay? So now I'm just sort of unpacking practically. What do we mean? What do we want? What do we want to know about our wives? Well, first thing here, is that every wife will have a certain propensity towards sin. Ladies are tempted in different ways according to a number of factors, according to personality, according to personal history and exposure to things, according to the particular temptations of their culture, according to their own spiritual walk in maturity or immaturity. There's 1,000 different things that go into why is one woman tempted towards gossip and being a loudmouth or a braggart, and others are more tempted to a cold and cryptic self-righteousness. Why is it that some wives will be tempted to overspend money, while other wives are tempted to be such misers that they are completely ungenerous to others? Why is it that some wives have a propensity to be overly dependent on their husbands and use them as a replacement for God, while other wives have a tendency to sin in terms of a sinful independence, right? Independence is fine, dependence is fine. It's just there's sinful versions of it, right? Why are they like that? Well, you know what? You don't always know the why, but you need to know the what. What propensities, what temptations is your wife prone toward? You should know that in order to help protect her, like we said in our lecture yesterday, right? To warn her, to protect her, not to condemn her. And that's the fight, right? Because oftentimes when her sin is inconvenient to me, my response is one of impatience and condemnation. But when her sin is not all that inconvenient to me, I sometimes won't even address it because it doesn't bother me. She's got that with God, right? So if she's talking about, if a wife is talking about other ladies or something like that, and it doesn't particularly bother the husband, and it fills the air so the husband doesn't have to talk, he's like, let's let it go. What big deal? It's gossip. If that same wife then shares something about him to one of the girls that makes him look negative, suddenly he's angry. Suddenly he's ticked off. So the gauge for whether we need to know the temptations and the propensities of our wives to sin should not be our own convenience. That's a very good principle for parenting too, by the way. Kids shouldn't be rebuked for their sin only when it ticks the parents off. They should be rebuked for their sin even when the parents kind of think it's funny. That's the hard part. We'll talk about that. But my point is, a man who knows his wife and can treat her as a fine china is going to know what particular ways she's tempted and is prone towards sin. Okay? So you also want to know her personality, strengths, and weaknesses. Okay? And all these are interrelated, by the way. So I am not recommending you do a Myers-Briggs test and get like the specific 1 of 16, or now I forget how many they do now in the different tests. But I'm not talking about personality in sort of according to the definition of some secular psychology. That's not what I'm saying. When I say personality, I simply mean the style with which a person relates to the world. How many people are in here? I don't know how many people are in here, but however many are, there's that many personalities. Probably more, actually. But you all have a certain given style with which you relate to the world. Some of you are optimistic. Just naturally, you tend to have a bright, kind of cheerful disposition. Some of you are pessimistic. You tend to see the negative, right? Those are personality features that aren't optimistic is a strength and pessimistic is a weakness. Nope. There are strengths and weaknesses, as I put here, to every personality facet. So for the optimist, okay, the strength of an optimist is what? Okay, is that a strength? How's that a strength is what I'm saying. You just defined it for us. But yeah, that's right. They can have hope. They can encourage others with a hopeful disposition and a hopeful attitude. They can cheer other people up. They can look at the positive side of almost any situation. That's a huge, wonderful strength. Is there a weakness to an optimist? What could be a weakness? That's right. Failure to be realistic. A failure to see reality as it actually is. Okay? So optimists are really good entrepreneurs, but those entrepreneurs will often fall flat on their face, right? When they don't see the realities that would oppose their particular plan, right? So don't think of optimist as positive, pessimist as negative. There's positive and negative to the optimist. There's positive and negatives to the pessimist. We always think of the negatives with a pessimist. What's the negatives? Debbie Downer. Yeah. Killjoy, Eeyore, whatever we want to say, right? What are the strengths of a pessimist? That's right. They have a worldview that's prepared in one sense for suffering, or that expects it. It's not surprised by it. That's a good thing. I've also noticed with people who tend to be more pessimistic, that they can also tend to recognize suffering in others better than people who tend to be optimistic. So their radar, their antenna is a little bit more sensitive to the people at church or other places who might be suffering, okay? So my point is, know your wife. Know what she tends toward and deal with her appropriately. So there was optimistic, pessimistic. There's extroverted and introverted. We always think of extroverted as strong and introverted as weak. That's not true, right? Extrovert, what are the strengths of the extrovert? Yeah, that's right. Why is that a strength? That's right. They can be encouraging, they can glad hand, they can network, they can just be a source of energy collectively. That's good. What's a negative? What's a weakness of an extrovert? That's right. They might want to be the center of attention. They might be obsessed more with the affirmation of people than they are with pleasing God. That's a particular temptation to an extrovert. What's an introvert? We always think of the weakness of an introvert. What's a weakness of an introvert? Yeah. That's right. They can appear cold, they can appear shy, they can appear unengaged. They don't like to be around people, they like to be alone. But what's a strength? What's a strength of someone who's more introverted? That's right. Sometimes they're excellent listeners. Normally they're far better at being reflective and thoughtful rather than just kind of active and speaking. Like the people, my friends who are introverts, they minister to me in ways that are different than my friends who tend to be more extroverted. By the way, when I keep saying introvert and extrovert, we don't want to act like there's two classifications of people. It's a sliding scale. Everybody's kind of different and has their own nuances, so we just got to be careful. But my point is, my friends who tend to be sort of more inward, when I sit with them, the conversation does not go how I'm naturally comfortable with it. I'm more on the extroverted side, so I want to make sure every minute of the conversation is filled with some audible word. I'm very uncomfortable with silence. But when I have these conversations, it forces me into being more thoughtful about the topics that we're doing and being okay with silence, right? That's a good thing. With extroverts, they energize me, right? And they probably energize many of you, unless you're like super introverted and those people annoy you, okay? But my point is, know your wife, and it doesn't take you to give her a Myers-Briggs personality test and to know her personality. So, optimist, pessimist, extrovert, introvert, things like, is she task-oriented or is she relationship-oriented? Okay? Again, these things aren't exclusive. It's a sliding scale. But does your wife tend to think more in terms of who can I relate to today, or does she tend to think more in terms of what do I need to accomplish for today? So I have talked to many friends who have wives that aren't exactly relationally oriented. And it bothers them that they don't have these close bosom buddy kind of relationships where they're talking about the deepest things of the Spirit and the highest things of heaven, and aren't plugged in those circles. They're kind of content to just sort of get things done around the house, make sure everything's in order, and when they serve at church, they're happy to be the one cleaning and serving, cleaning up afterwards, setting up beforehand, rather than the one sitting with ladies patting hands. Okay? That's just a matter of gifting, right? It doesn't mean that a task-oriented person should have no relationships. They should work on relationships. But that's a gift, right? We should love that God equips the body with people who love to get things done and aren't all that interested in chatting, okay? But we should also value people who maybe aren't as good at getting things done. That's not their worldview so much, but they're just super relationally engaged, and they want to make sure that everybody's cared for, and we need all different types in the body of Christ. And a husband serves his wife well when he recognizes the type of the style that she is and puts her in situations where she can flourish, rather than putting her in situations where it feels overly burdensome and unhelpful. So, I mean, I could go through a number of different kind of binaries on the sliding scale. You have external processors and internal processors, right? You have wives who like to think by talking out loud, okay? And then you have wives who like to think on their own. And a husband, this is where it's hard, right? A husband might tend to be an internal processor, but his wife is an external processor, and vice versa, by the way. But the husband doesn't live with his wife in an understanding way if he's expecting her to think in the same way that he particularly thinks. So if he likes to be alone to quietly reflect, and his wife is liking to talk out what they're doing in the weekend, or talk out what the family budget's going to be like, or talk it out externally, he shouldn't stew and be annoyed that she's nagging him. He should love that and value that and live with her in an understanding way and be willing to enter into talking about things externally. One last sort of binary that I think of is you have some ladies who are tough and some ladies who are really sensitive. And there's a sliding scale there. A man should not handle his wife roughly if she's extremely tender, right? If she's just sensitive in her personality, doesn't like sarcasm, might feel easily offended, like, if you call me a silly name, that feels insulting to me, then don't call her a silly name. Others tend to be just really tough, and they love stuff like that. They love sarcasm. They love joking. That's okay. So just know the personality strengths and weaknesses of the wife. I believe that's part of the calling of God for husbands. Okay? And then know her preferences. Know her preferences. Know her preferences. What does she prefer? What does she want? What does she value? You could put values here, or desires, or something like that. But know them, not necessarily so that you always have to capitulate to them. That's not a marriage, right? Because she has to. There is compromise. There is coming together to a common vision in marriage. But know her preferences. It shouldn't surprise you if one day she tells you she can't stand going to the restaurant that you guys always go to. That shouldn't be a surprise to you. Know what she wants. With some wives, it's just extremely easy to know their preferences. They are very eager to make them known, all right? But with other wives, with other sort of personality types that are maybe more naturally deferential, you got to draw it out. You got to listen to them, and you got to help know what ministers to her, okay?